In the 1930s and 1950s, hillbilly families knew how to make candies that mattered. Their work in the kitchen didn't just pull taffy by hand. They twisted sorghum into candy and cooked wild honey until it turned into hard candy. These 60 forgotten hillbilly candies might sound too plain today, but they kept families together through the hardest years. Let's rediscover what grandmothers made when sugar was scarce and candy was homemade. Sorghum twist candy wasn't store-bought. It survived when sorghum syrup was cheaper than white sugar, and hillbilly families made it in under 30 minutes when there was nothing else sweet. The candy was dark and glossy, twisted into thick ropes that hardened into brittle pieces. The smell was dark sorghum and burnt butter, and the taste was earthy sweet, not like refined sugar candy, but deeper and almost bitter. It cost about 15 cents, sorghum from the jug, butter from the churn. Some families twisted it into braids on good days when neighbors came over, but most twisted alone because there was nobody within walking distance. Children sucked on the pieces slowly because biting down too hard could crack your teeth. The candy stayed sticky in summer and turned rock hard in winter. If the sorghum twist felt too rough, what came next was softer and pulled until it turned light. Brown sugar pull candy was made when white sugar ran out, and brown sugar was all that was left in the jar. Hillbilly families boiled it until it hardened, then pulled it by hand until it turned glossy and light. The candy was chewy and smooth, lighter in color than sorghum, but darker than white sugar candy. The smell was caramel and butter, and the taste was rich and molasses sweet. It cost about 20 cents. Brown sugar from the sack, butter from the churn, a splash of vinegar to keep it from crystallizing. Some mothers pulled the candy with their daughters on Sunday afternoons, stretching it between 4 hands until their arms ached. Others pulled it alone at the kitchen table after the dishes were washed. The candy hardened within minutes and had to be cut with scissors before it turned too brittle to bite. If brown sugar pull candy felt too sweet, what came next was wild and tasted like the mountain itself. Mountain honey drops were made when wild honey was harvested from hollow trees and there was enough left over after canning. Hillbilly families boiled the honey until it hardened into small, amber-colored drops that tasted like flowers and wood smoke. The candy was smooth and glossy, shaped like teardrops or flattened into discs. The smell was floral and faintly smoky, and the taste was intensely sweet with a sharp edge that stung your throat. It cost almost nothing. Honey, foraged from the forest, no sugar needed. Some families made honey drops every fall after the bees were smoked out and the combs were harvested. Children waited by the stove, watching the honey bubble and thicken until their mothers dropped spoonfuls onto a greased plate. The drops hardened quickly and were stored in jars, rationed out through the winter when there was nothing else sweet. If mountain honey drops felt too wild, what came next was clear and brittle and shattered like glass. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Skillet sugar glass candy was made when there was nothing left but white sugar and water. Hillbilly families boiled sugar in a cast-iron skillet until it turned clear and glossy, then poured it onto a greased plate to harden into thin, brittle sheets. The candy was transparent and sharp-edged, cracking into shards that cut your tongue if you weren't careful. The smell was faint, just burnt sugar, and the taste was pure sweetness with no flavor. It cost about 20 cents, 2 cups of sugar, half a cup of water. Some children called it glass candy because it looked like broken window panes. Mothers made it when the pantry was empty and there was nothing else to sweeten the day. The candy didn't last long. It melted in the heat and shattered when dropped, but for a few hours it felt like something special. If skillet sugar glass felt too plain, what came next was richer. and made with butter that melted on your tongue. Butter-boiled sweet squares were made when the butter churn was full and there was sugar left in the sack. Hillbilly families boiled butter with sugar until it thickened into a golden syrup, then poured it into a shallow pan and cut it into squares once it cooled. The candy was soft and buttery, melting slowly in your mouth. The smell was rich, browned butter and caramelized sugar, and the taste was smooth and sweet with a hint of salt. It cost about 30 cents. Butter from the churn, sugar from the sack. Some families made butter squares on Sundays after church, serving them on small plates with coffee. If butter squares felt too rich, what came next was darker and tasted like molasses mixed with smoke. The first 5 candies were boiled from basics: sorghum twisted by hand, brown sugar pulled until light, mountain honey drops from wild bees, sugar glass broken into shards, and butter boiled into soft squares. But the next 5 go deeper into pantry staples: cane syrup chews, farmhouse molasses bites, old-time pantry caramel, soft maple rolls, and Sunday sugar pulls. Cane syrup chew candy wasn't soft. It was candy when cane syrup was pressed at home and cost nothing. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Boil cane syrup with a little butter until it reached the firm ball stage. Pour onto a greased plate. Let it cool until barely warm. Cut into small pieces with buttered scissors. Wrap each piece in waxed paper if you had it. The smell was sweet cane and butter. The taste was chewy, thick molasses flavor, sticky and dark, pulling at your teeth with every bite. It cost about 20 cents in 1955 if you bought cane syrup, or nothing if you pressed your own sugar cane. This worked because sugar cane grew in warmer mountain valleys. Pressing syrup required only a hand-crank mill, and the syrup lasted for months without refrigeration. No added sugar, no flavoring, just pure cane syrup boiled until chewy. Some families added a handful of peanuts to the hot syrup before cooling, but most kept it plain because nuts cost money. The candy stuck to the waxed paper and pulled your fillings loose if you weren't careful. But if cane syrup chews felt too sticky, what came next was firmer and used molasses. Farmhouse molasses bites weren't sweet. They were candy when blackstrap molasses was cheaper than white sugar and tasted like medicine. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 20 minutes. Boil blackstrap molasses with a spoonful of butter and a splash of vinegar until it reached the hard crack stage. Pour onto a greased plate. Let it cool until brittle. Break into bite-sized pieces with a hammer. The smell was dark molasses and vinegar. The taste was bittersweet, medicinal, earthy, not like candy, but like something you took when you were sick. It cost about 15 cents in 1945. Blackstrap molasses from the jug, butter from the churn, vinegar from the crock. This worked because blackstrap molasses was the cheapest sweetener available, left over after making white sugar, and mountain families bought it by the gallon. No refined sugar needed, no flavor to hide the bitterness. Just boil until it cracked. Children hated it because it tasted too much like cough syrup, but mothers made it anyway because sugar cost money and molasses was cheap. The candy turned your tongue black and stuck in your teeth for hours. But if molasses bites felt too bitter, what came next was smoother and made with cream. Old-time pantry caramel wasn't wrapped. It was candy when cream, sugar, and butter were the only luxuries you had. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 40 minutes. Combine 2 cups of white sugar, 1 cup of cream, and half a cup of butter in a heavy pot. Cook slowly over low heat while stirring constantly until it reached the firm ball stage. Pour into a greased pan. Let it cool completely. Cut into squares with a buttered knife. The smell was browned butter and caramelized cream. The taste was rich, Smooth caramel, buttery and sweet, melting slowly on your tongue. It cost about 70 cents in 1955. White sugar from the store, cream skimmed from milk, butter from the churn. This worked because cream and butter were free if you kept a cow, sugar was cheap in bulk, and stirring for 40 minutes cost nothing but time. No candy thermometer needed if you tested in cold water. Some families added a pinch of salt at the end to cut the sweetness, but most kept it plain because salt was for cooking, not candy. The caramel stayed soft and chewy at room temperature and lasted for weeks in a tin. But if pantry caramel felt too fancy, what came next was simpler and made with maple. Soft maple roll candy wasn't hard. It was candy when maple syrup was tapped from trees in late winter and cost nothing. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Boil pure maple syrup until it reached the soft ball stage, pour it onto a greased marble slab or cold plate, let it cool until barely warm, work it with a wooden spoon until it turned creamy and light-colored, roll it into a log, slice into rounds. The smell was pure maple. The taste was sweet and earthy. Concentrated maple flavor, creamy texture, not grainy like fudge, but smooth. It cost nothing in 1945 if you tapped your own maple trees, or $1 if you bought syrup from a neighbor. This worked because sugar maple trees grew throughout the mountains. Tapping required only a drill and a bucket, and syrup lasted forever. No added sugar, no butter, no cream. Just pure maple syrup boiled and worked until creamy. Some families added chopped walnuts to the soft candy before rolling, but most kept it plain because the maple flavor was strong enough. The candy stayed soft and melted in warm weather, so it was only made in late winter. But if maple rolls felt too seasonal, what came next was year-round and pulled on Sundays. Sunday sugar pulls weren't daily candy. They were entertainment when church was over and the family had nothing else to do. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 1 hour. Boil 2 cups of white sugar with half a cup of water and a spoonful of vinegar until it reached the hard ball stage. Pour onto greased plates for each person. Let it cool until barely touchable. Butter everyone's hands, pull the candy back and forth in pairs until it turned from clear to opaque white and became glossy. The smell was hot sugar and vinegar. The taste was pure sweetness, no flavor beyond sugar, but the pulling made it lighter and easier to chew. It cost about 30 cents in 1955, white sugar from the store, vinegar from the pantry. This worked because sugar was cheap when bought in bulk, pulling candy required no tools, and it kept children occupied for an hour after church. No flavoring, no color, no shapes, just pull until it lightened. Families made it a social event. Everyone pulled together, laughing when someone's batch turned grainy or sticky instead of glossy. The candy hardened as it cooled and had to be cut with scissors before it became brittle. But if Sunday sugar pulls felt too plain, what came next was smokier and used hickory. Hickory smoke sugar candy wasn't flavored with extracts. It was candy when wood smoke was the only flavor available and sugar was cheap. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Build a fire with hickory wood, boil white sugar with water in a cast-iron pot directly over the hickory smoke. Let the smoke infuse the sugar as it cooked to the hard crack stage. Pour onto a greased plate. Let it cool and harden, break into pieces. The smell was hickory smoke and burnt sugar. The taste was unusual. Sweet with a smoky undertone like bacon mixed with candy, not for everyone but unforgettable. It cost about 25 cents in 1945. White sugar from the store, hickory wood from the forest. This worked because hickory trees grew everywhere in the mountains, splitting wood cost nothing but labor, and smoke flavoring required no store-bought extracts. no vanilla. No peppermint, just smoke. Some families accidentally discovered this when boiling candy outdoors over a wood fire, and the smoke-infused sugar tasted different enough to make on purpose. The candy tasted like campfire and sweet, which children either loved or hated with no middle ground. But if hickory smoke felt too strong, what came next was lighter and full of bubbles. Sorghum bubble candy wasn't smooth. It was candy when sorghum syrup and baking soda created something light and crunchy. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 20 minutes. Boil sorghum syrup with a little butter until it reached the hard crack stage. Remove from heat, stir in a teaspoon of baking soda. The mixture foamed up immediately and turned pale. Pour quickly onto a greased pan before the foam collapsed. Let it cool and harden, break into chunks. The smell was dark sorghum and burnt sugar. The taste was crunchy, honeycomb texture, airy and light, sorghum flavor throughout. It cost about 20 cents in 1955. Sorghum syrup from the jug, baking soda from the box, butter from the churn. This worked because sorghum was cheap or free. If you grew it, baking soda was a pantry staple, and the chemical reaction created texture without expensive ingredients. No whipping, no beating, just stir in baking soda and watch it foam. Some families called it sea foam, even though they'd never seen the ocean, while others called it sponge candy because of the holes. The candy was fragile and crumbled if you squeezed it, but melted slowly on your tongue with a satisfying crunch. But if sorghum bubbles felt too delicate, what came next was firmer and twisted into ribbons. Corn syrup ribbon candy wasn't colorful. It was candy when corn syrup was cheaper than sugar, and you could twist it into shapes. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 40 minutes. Boil corn syrup with a little sugar and butter until it reached the hard crack stage. Pour onto a greased marble slab. Let it cool until pliable. Pull it into long, thin ropes. Twist the ropes into flat ribbons while still warm. Cut into lengths with scissors. The smell was sweet corn syrup. The taste was mild. Not as strong as molasses or sorghum, but sweeter and lighter, sticking to your teeth. It cost about 30 cents in 1945. Corn syrup from the jar, white sugar from the store, butter from the churn. This worked because corn syrup was shelf-stable and never crystallized like pure sugar, making it easier to work with. No food coloring, no peppermint oil. Just plain corn syrup twisted into ribbons. Some families tried to make it look like store-bought ribbon candy by twisting 2 batches together, but it never came out right without color. The ribbons stuck together in the jar and had to be separated with buttered fingers before eating. But if corn syrup ribbons felt too sticky, what came next was darker and burnt on purpose. Burnt sugar crumble candy wasn't an accident. It was candy when you cooked sugar too long and decided to keep it instead of throwing it away. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 20 minutes. Heat white sugar in a cast-iron skillet over high heat without stirring until it melted and turned dark brown, almost black. Pour it onto a greased plate before it started smoking. Let it cool and harden completely. Break into irregular chunks with a hammer. The smell was caramelized sugar on the edge of burning. The taste was bitter-sweet, intensely caramelized, almost coffee-like. Not for children, but adults appreciated the complexity. It cost about 15 cents in 1955, white sugar from the store. This worked because burnt sugar required only heat and patience, no added ingredients, and what would have been considered a mistake became a candy with deeper flavor. No butter, no water, no corn syrup. Just dry sugar cooked until it darkened. Some families used burnt sugar to flavor coffee or color gravy, but others ate it as candy because sweetness was sweetness, even when burnt. The candy was brittle and sharp-edged, cutting the roof of your mouth if you weren't careful. But if burnt sugar felt too harsh, what came next was softer and made in a tin pan. Tinpan toffee bits weren't measured. They were candy when butter, sugar, and a tin pan were all you had. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 25 minutes. Melt butter in a tin pan directly over the fire, add white sugar, stir constantly as it melted and turned golden brown, cook until it reached the hard crack stage, pour onto a greased plate, let it cool partially, score into squares with a knife, let it harden completely. The smell was browned butter and caramelized sugar. The taste was rich, buttery toffee, crunchy and golden, sticking to your teeth. It cost about 40 cents in 1945. Butter from the churn, white sugar from the store. This worked because butter and sugar were the only ingredients needed. Tin pans conducted heat well, and cooking directly over the fire-saved stove fuel. No nuts, no chocolate coating, no fancy shapes, just butter and sugar cooked until golden. Some families added a pinch of salt at the end to balance the sweetness, but most ate it plain because the butter flavor was strong enough. The toffee stuck to the tin pan and had to be soaked in hot water to clean, but the candy was worth the scrubbing. But if tin pan toffee felt too buttery, what came next was lighter and cooked in a kettle. The first 15 candies were boiled and pulled: sorghum twists, brown sugar pulls, honey drops, sugar glass, butter squares, cane syrup chews, molasses bites, pantry caramel, maple rolls, Sunday sugar pulls, hickory smoke candy, sorghum bubbles, corn syrup ribbons, burnt sugar crumbles, and tin pan toffee. But the next 5 go into kettle and skillet territory. Kettle-cooked syrup chips weren't thick. They were candy when sorghum syrup was boiled thin and poured into flat sheets. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Boil sorghum syrup in a large kettle until it reached the hard crack stage. Pour it in a thin layer onto a greased marble slab or cold metal sheet. Let it cool and harden into a brittle sheet. Break into irregular chips with your hands. The smell was dark sorghum. The taste was intense, concentrated sorghum flavor, brittle and thin like glass, and dissolving quickly on your tongue. It cost about 20 cents in 1955, sorghum syrup from the jug. This worked because sorghum was cheap or free if you grew it. Boiling it thin made it last longer, and brittle chips were easier to store than sticky taffy. No added ingredients, no flavor beyond sorghum. Just boil and pour thin. Some families stored the chips in tin cans with waxed paper between layers to keep them from sticking together, but most ate them immediately because they absorbed moisture from the air and turned sticky within days. The chips cut your tongue if you bit down wrong and melted into a sticky mess in humid weather. But if syrup chips felt too thin, what came next was thicker and full of air. Honeycomb skillet candy wasn't made with honey. It was candy when sugar, corn syrup, and baking soda created a sponge-like texture. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 20 minutes. Combine white sugar and corn syrup in a cast-iron skillet, cook over medium heat until it reached the hard crack stage, remove from heat, stir in baking soda, it foamed violently and doubled in size, pour immediately into a greased pan, let it cool and harden, break into chunks. The smell was burnt sugar. The taste was sweet and airy, crunchy honeycomb texture with big bubbles throughout, dissolving quickly in your mouth. It cost about 30 cents in 1945. white sugar and corn syrup from the store, baking soda from the box. This worked because the chemical reaction between hot sugar and baking soda created air bubbles without whipping or beating, and the texture made a little sugar stretch further. No cream, no butter, and no eggs, just sugar, syrup, and baking soda. Some families dipped the cooled honeycomb in melted chocolate if they could afford it, but most ate it plain because chocolate cost money. The candy was fragile and crumbled into powder if dropped, but the crunchy texture made it special. But if honeycomb felt too fancy, what came next was simpler and made in chunks. Buttered cane sugar chunks weren't shaped. They were candy when raw cane sugar and butter were boiled together and left to harden in the pan. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 20 minutes. Melt butter in a saucepan, add raw cane sugar, the tan, coarse kind, stir over medium heat until the sugar dissolved and turned golden, cook until it reached the soft crack stage, pour into a greased pan, let it cool partially, and score into rough chunks with a knife, let it harden completely. The smell was caramelized butter and raw sugar. The taste was grainy, not smooth like refined candy, but coarse and crunchy, with molasses undertones from the raw sugar. It cost about 40 cents in 1955, raw cane sugar from the store, butter from the churn. This worked because raw cane sugar was cheaper than white refined sugar, butter added richness, and the candy required no precision. No candy thermometer, no specific temperature, just cook until golden. Slow-boiled pantry fudge wasn't chocolate. It was candy when sugar, milk, and butter were boiled slowly until thick and creamy. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this fudge in under 40 minutes. Combine 2 cups of white sugar with 1 cup of milk and a large spoonful of butter in a heavy pot. Cook slowly over low heat while stirring constantly to prevent scorching. Boil until it reached the soft ball stage. Remove from heat. Beat with a wooden spoon until thick and creamy. Pour into a greased pan. Let it cool and firm up. Cut into squares. The smell was caramelized milk and butter. The taste was sweet and creamy, like caramel fudge without the caramel color, smooth and rich. It cost about 50 cents in 1945. White sugar from the store, milk from the cow, butter from the churn. This worked because slow cooking prevented crystallization and created smooth fudge without chocolate. Milk and butter were free if you kept a cow, and stirring for 40 minutes cost nothing but time and patience. No thermometer needed if you tested in cold water. The fudge stayed soft and creamy at room temperature and lasted for days in a tin. But if slow-boiled fudge felt too plain, what came next was harder, and made for working men. Farmhand sweet hardtack wasn't candy. It was survival when men needed energy in their pockets during long days in the fields. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this hardtack in under 30 minutes. Mix white sugar with just enough water to form a thick paste, add a spoonful of flour to bind it, press the mixture flat onto a greased pan, cut into small squares, and bake in a low oven until completely dried and rock hard. The smell was baked sugar and flour. The taste was barely sweet, hard as a rock, dissolved slowly in your mouth, more like a sugar brick than candy. It cost about 20 cents in 1955, white sugar and flour from the pantry. This worked because the sugar provided quick energy, flour held it together, and drying it completely made it last for weeks without spoiling in a pocket. No wrapper needed, no refrigeration, just sugar and flour pressed flat and dried. Some families added a pinch of salt to replace what men lost sweating in the fields, but most kept it plain because the purpose was energy, not flavor. The hardtac was so hard it could break a tooth if you bit down wrong, but sucking on it slowly released sweetness over an hour. But if Farmhand hardtac felt too hard, what came next was softer and came from wild apples. The first 20 candies were made in kitchens and over fires, from soft maple rolls to Farmhand hardtac so hard it could break your teeth. But the next 10 go deeper into the mountains. Green apple peel candy, mountain berry chews, wild plum drops, cooked peach pit candy, and autumn pear leather. Green apple peel candy wasn't wasteful. It was candy when you peeled apples for pies and refused to throw away the peels. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 40 minutes. Collect apple peels from making applesauce or pies, layer them in a pot with white sugar between each layer, add just enough water to cover the bottom of the pot. Cook slowly over low heat until the sugar dissolved and the peels turned translucent and candied. Drain off excess syrup, spread the candied peels on a greased plate to cool, roll each peel in granulated sugar. The smell was tart apples and sweet sugar. The taste was intense. Sour apple skin balanced with sugar, chewy and slightly tough, concentrated apple flavor. It cost about 20 cents in 1945. Apples from the orchard, white sugar from the store. This worked because apples grew everywhere in the mountains. Peeling them for other recipes left pounds of peels, and candying them meant nothing went to waste. No added pectin, no special ingredients. Just peels, sugar, and time. Some families candied the peels with cinnamon or cloves, but most kept them plain because the apple flavor was strong enough and spices cost money. The candied peels stayed chewy and sticky, and stored in a jar with waxed paper between layers to keep them from clumping together. Children ate them like candy strips, sucking on each peel until the sugar dissolved. Adults added them to oatmeal or bread dough for sweetness. By the 1960s, when people started buying pre-made pies and stopped peeling apples at home, green apple peel candy disappeared from mountain kitchens. But during the 1940s and 50s, it was a practical way to turn waste into sweetness, proving that nothing, not even apple peels, was too small to candy when sugar was cheap and waste was unacceptable. But if apple peel candy felt too chewy, what came next was softer and made from wild berries. Mountain berry sugar chews weren't store-bought. They were candy when wild blackberries, huckleberries, and raspberries grew free on the mountainside. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 1 hour. Pick wild berries from the thickets. Mash them in a pot to release the juice. Strain out the seeds through a cloth. Boil the juice with an equal amount of white sugar. Cook slowly while stirring until it thickened into a paste. Pour onto a greased pan. Let it cool until firm but still pliable. Cut into small squares with a buttered knife. Roll each square in granulated sugar. The smell was wild berries and cooked sugar. The taste was tart-sweet. Concentrated berry flavor, chewy texture like fruit leather but firmer, sticking to your teeth. It cost nothing in 1955 if you picked the berries yourself, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because wild berries grew thick on every mountainside in late summer. Picking them required only time and tolerance for thorns. And the candy preserved the harvest without canning jars. No added pectin, no gelatin, just berry juice and sugar boiled until thick. Some families made it with one type of berry, while others mixed whatever they found. Blackberries, raspberries, huckleberries, dewberries, creating a complex flavor that changed with every batch. The chews stayed soft in cool weather, but melted into sticky clumps in summer heat. Families stored them in tin cans in the root cellar, eating them through winter when fresh fruit was a memory. Children took them to school in their pockets, trading them for marbles or pencils. By the 1970s, when people stopped foraging and started buying fruit at grocery stores, mountain berry sugar chews became a lost art. But during the 1950s, it was a practical way to preserve wild fruit, and turning free berries into candy that lasted for months. But if berry chews felt too soft, what came next was harder and made from wild plums. Wild plum syrup drops weren't sweet. They were candy when wild plums grew sour and small on scrub trees. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 50 minutes. Gather wild plums from the thickets, cut them open and remove the pits, cook the plums with white sugar and a little water until they broke down completely. Strain the mixture through a cloth to remove the skins, boil the strained liquid until it thickened into syrup. Continue cooking until it reached the hardball stage, drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate, let them cool and harden into drops. The smell was tart plums and caramelized sugar. The taste was sour-sweet, wild plum flavor concentrated into hard candy, mouth-puckering at first, then sweetening as it dissolved. It cost nothing in 1945 if you foraged the plums, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because wild plum trees grew dense in abandoned fields and along fence rows. The fruit was too sour to eat fresh, but perfect for candy, and hard drops lasted indefinitely without refrigeration. No added flavor, no food coloring, just plum and sugar. Some families left the drops plain and clear, while others rolled them in powdered sugar to keep them from sticking together. The drops were so sour they made your face pucker, but children loved the challenge of sucking on them until the sourness faded to sweetness. Adults used them as throat lozenges during winter colds. By the 1960s, when orchards started grafting sweet plum varieties and wild plums were ignored, wild plum syrup drops disappeared from candy jars. But during the 1940s and 50s, they were a practical way to use fruit nobody else wanted, turning sour wild plums into hard candy that could be stored for months. The drops stuck together in humid weather and had to be separated with powdered sugar, but the intense flavor made them memorable. But if wild plum drops felt too sour, what came next was sweeter and made from peach pits. Cooked peach pit candy wasn't common. It was candy when peach kernels inside the pits tasted like bitter almonds, and you had nothing else to flavor sugar. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 1 hour. Crack open peach pits with a hammer to extract the inner kernels, blanch the kernels in boiling water to remove the bitter skin, chop them fine, boil white sugar with a little water until it reached the soft ball stage, stir in the chopped kernels, pour onto a greased plate, let it cool and harden, break into chunks. The smell was bitter almond and sweet sugar. The taste was unusual, nutty and slightly bitter, like marzipan, but rougher, not for everyone. It cost nothing in 1955 if you saved pits from canning peaches, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because peach pits were normally thrown away. The kernels inside tasted similar to expensive almond extract, and cracking pits required only a hammer and patience. No store-bought flavoring, no vanilla, no peppermint, just peach kernels that tasted like almonds. Some families worried about toxicity. Raw peach kernels contained trace amounts of cyanide, but cooking and blanching removed most of it, and small amounts posed little risk. The candy had a grainy texture from the chopped kernels and a bitter undertone that some people loved and others hated. By the 1970s, when almond extract became affordable and people stopped saving peach pits, cooked peach pit candy disappeared completely. But during the 1950s, it was a clever way to create almond-flavored candy without buying expensive extracts, turning waste pits into something that tasted fancy. The candy stayed hard at room temperature and lasted for weeks in a tin. But if peach pit candy felt too bitter, what came next was milder and made from pears. Autumn pear leather candy wasn't rolled. It was candy when pears ripened all at once and you couldn't eat them fast enough. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 3 hours. Peel and core ripe pears, cook them with a little water until they broke down into a thick puree, stir in white sugar while cooking. Continue cooking while stirring constantly until the mixture thickened into a paste that pulled away from the sides of the pot. Spread the hot paste thin on a greased pan or oiled cloth. Let it dry in the sun or near the wood stove for 2 days. Peel it off the surface. Cut into strips with scissors, roll each strip into a coil. The smell was sweet pears and cooked sugar. The taste was concentrated. Pure pear flavor intensified by cooking, chewy like fruit leather but firmer, sticking to your teeth. It cost nothing in 1945 if you grew pears, plus about 20 cents for sugar. This worked because pear trees produced abundantly every fall, the fruit spoiled quickly if not preserved, and drying the puree required no canning jars or special equipment. No added pectin, no gelatin, just pears and sugar cooked until thick. Some families added a squeeze of lemon juice to brighten the flavor. But most kept it plain because pears were sweet enough. The leather stayed pliable in cool weather but turned brittle in winter cold. Families stored it rolled in waxed paper, stacked in tins, eating it through winter when fresh fruit was gone. Children unrolled the strips slowly, making them last as long as possible. By the 1960s, when people stopped drying fruit and started buying canned pears from the store, autumn pear leather candy became a forgotten skill. But during the 1940s and 50s, it was a practical way to preserve the harvest, turning pounds of ripe pears into candy that lasted for months. But if pear leather felt too plain, what came next was crunchier and made with crackers. The first 25 candies were made from gardens and wild places: apple peels, mountain berries, wild plum drops, peach pit kernels, and autumn pear leather. But the next 5 go into pantry experiment: sorghum cracker candy, black apple molasses candy, skillet burn candy, corn husk wrapped sweets, and wood stove syrup stones. Sorghum cracker candy wasn't fancy. It was candy when saltine crackers and sorghum syrup were cheaper than making candy from scratch. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 20 minutes. Line a baking pan with saltine crackers in a single layer. Boil sorghum syrup with a large spoonful of butter until it reached the soft crack stage. Pour the hot syrup evenly over the crackers. Let it cool until the syrup hardened. Break into pieces along the cracker lines. The smell was salty crackers and dark sorghum. The taste was salty sweet, crunchy crackers, chewy sorghum toffee, the salt cutting through the molasses sweetness. It cost about 35 cents in 1955. Saltine crackers from the box, sorghum syrup from the jug, butter from the churn. This worked because saltines were cheap and shelf-stable, sorghum was cheaper than white sugar, and the combination created a candy that tasted more complex than its simple ingredients. No rolling, no pulling, no shaping, just pour and cool. Some families sprinkled chopped peanuts on top before the syrup hardened, while others left it plain because nuts cost money. The candy stayed crunchy in dry weather, but turned soft and sticky in humidity. Families stored it in tin cans, with waxed paper between layers, eating it piece by piece through winter. Children loved the salty-sweet combination. while adults appreciated that it used up stale crackers that would otherwise go to waste. By the 1970s, when toffee became associated with fancy candy shops and saltines with soup, sorghum cracker candy disappeared from mountain kitchens. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical way to make candy quickly, turning pantry staples into something that felt special. The crackers absorbed some of the sorghum syrup, creating a layered texture. Crunchy cracker, chewy toffee, salty and sweet in every bite. But if cracker candy felt too salty, what came next was darker and made with blackened apples. Black apple molasses candy wasn't beautiful. It was candy when apples dried on the tree until they turned black and shriveled. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 1 hour. Collect dried apples that stayed on the tree through winter, black, wrinkled, and concentrated. Chop them into small pieces, cook them with blackstrap molasses and a little water until the apples broke down completely. Continue cooking while stirring until the mixture thickened into a dark paste. Spread it thin on a greased pan. Let it cool and firm up. Cut into squares with a buttered knife. The smell was dried apples and bitter molasses. The taste was intense, dark, almost medicinal concentrated apple and molasses flavors that overwhelmed your mouth. It cost nothing in 1945 if you gathered dried apples from abandoned orchards, plus about 15 cents for molasses. This worked because apples left on trees through winter dried naturally. No one else wanted them, and blackstrap molasses was the cheapest sweetener available. No added sugar. No spices, just dried apples and molasses cooked until thick. Some families called it black candy because of its dark color, while others refused to make it because it looked too much like chewing tobacco. The candy was chewy and sticky, turning your teeth black temporarily. Children hated it because the molasses tasted too strong, but mothers made it anyway because dried apples were free and molasses cost almost nothing. By the 1960s, when people stopped letting apples dry on trees and blackstrap molasses fell out of use, a black apple molasses candy disappeared completely. But during the 1940s and 50s, it was a practical way to salvage fruit nobody else wanted, turning black dried apples into candy that lasted for months. The candy stuck to the waxed paper and had to be peeled off carefully, but the intense flavor made it memorable even if not pleasant. But if black apple candy felt too strong, what came next was simpler and made by accident. Skillet burn candy wasn't intentional. It was candy when you burned sugar in a cast-iron skillet and decided to keep it instead of scrubbing the pan. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy by accident. Heat white sugar in a dry cast-iron skillet over high heat. Forget to stir or watch it carefully. Let the sugar caramelize too far until it turned dark brown and smelled burnt. Pour it quickly onto a greased plate before it turned completely black. Let it cool and harden into brittle sheets, break into irregular shards. The smell was burnt caramel and smoke. The taste was bittersweet, intensely caramelized sugar on the edge of burning, coffee-like and complex. Not for children. It cost about 15 cents in 1955, white sugar from the store. This worked because the burned sugar was already cooked, and pouring it out meant you didn't have to scrub the skillet, wasting time and effort. No butter, no water, no careful watching, just burn and pour. Some families discovered that burned sugar tasted interesting enough to make on purpose, cooking it to the edge of burning deliberately, while others only made it when they accidentally scorched a batch of regular candy. The candy was sharp-edged and brittle, shattering into shards that cut the roof of your mouth if you weren't careful. Adults ate it with coffee because the flavors matched, while children avoided it because it tasted too bitter. By the 1970s, when candy thermometers and precise recipes became common, skillet burn candy disappeared because people stopped burning sugar by accident. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical way to salvage a mistake, turning burned sugar into something edible instead of wasting it. The shards stayed crunchy and lasted indefinitely in a tin, never softening or melting even in summer heat. But if burned candy felt too bitter, what came next was gentler and wrapped in corn husks. The corn husk wasn't shaped. It was candy when you boiled sugar paste and wrapped it in dried corn husks for storage. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 40 minutes. Boil white sugar with just enough water to dissolve it. Cook until it reached the soft ball stage. Let it cool until barely warm. Work it with your hands like dough until it turned creamy and opaque. Pinch off small pieces, roll each piece into a short log, wrap it in a dried corn husk. Tie the ends with string. The smell was sweet sugar and dried corn. The taste was pure sweetness, no flavor beyond sugar, but the texture was smooth and creamy like fondant. It cost about 25 cents in 1945. White sugar from the store, dried corn husks saved from harvest. This worked because corn husks were free and plentiful after harvest. They kept the candy from sticking together, and wrapping each piece individually made it easy to carry in your pocket. No waxed paper, no tin cans, just corn husks tied with string. Some families flavored the sugar paste with a drop of peppermint oil if they had it, but most kept it plain because the purpose was sweetness, not flavor. The wrapped candies stayed soft and creamy inside the husks, stored in baskets or hanging from rafters in the kitchen. Children unwrapped them carefully, saving the husks to make dolls or other toys. Adults carried them to church or social gatherings, offering them to neighbors as a sign of hospitality. By the 1960s, when plastic wrap and cellophane became common, corn husk-wrapped sweets disappeared because modern packaging was easier. But during the 1940s and 50s, it was a practical way to store and share homemade candy using natural materials that cost nothing. The corn husks added a faint earthy smell to the candy, and unwrapping each piece felt like opening a small gift. But if wrapped candy felt too plain, what came next was harder and cooked on the wood stove. Wood stove syrup stones weren't soft. They were candy when you boiled syrup directly on the wood stove until it turned into rocks. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Pour sorghum syrup or cane syrup into a cast iron pot. Place it on the hottest part of the wood stove. Let it boil without stirring until it reached the hard crack stage. Drop spoonfuls onto a greased metal sheet. Let them cool and harden into irregular lumps that looked like stones. The smell was burnt syrup and wood smoke. The taste was intense. Concentrated syrup flavor, hard as rocks, taking minutes to dissolve in your mouth. It cost about 20 cents in 1955, sorghum or cane syrup from the jug. This worked because the wood stove provided consistent high heat, syrup was cheaper than sugar, and the candy required no attention beyond checking it occasionally. No stirring, no temperature testing, no precise timing. Just boil until it cracked in cold water. Some families made huge batches during winter when the wood stove burned all day anyway, wasting no extra fuel, while others made it only when they had leftover syrup at the end of the season. The stones were so hard they could break your teeth if you bit down, instead of sucking on them slowly. Children carried them in their pockets to school, sucking on one stone for an entire afternoon because they dissolved so slowly. Adults used them as a substitute for chewing tobacco, something to keep in your cheek while working. By the 1970s, when wood stoves were replaced by electric or gas stoves, wood stove syrup stones disappeared because boiling syrup on a modern stove didn't impart the same smoky flavor. But during the 1950s and 60s, they were a practical way to make hard candy using the heat that was already burning, turning cheap syrup into candy that lasted for months. The wood smoke flavor infused the syrup, creating a taste you couldn't replicate on a modern stove. Sweet, smoky, and intensely concentrate. But if syrup stones felt too hard, what came next was softer and made with medicinal ingredients. The first 30 candies were made from gardens, forests, or in kitchens, from green apple peels to wood stove syrup stones so hard they could break your teeth. But the next 10 go into medicinal territory: pine needle drops, bitter root honey candy, wild bark syrup chews, campfire smoke candy, and herbal kettle sweets. Pine needle sugar drops weren't sweet. They were candy when pine needles made medicinal tea, and you decided to boil it with sugar. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 1 hour. Collect fresh pine needles from white pine or spruce trees, chop them fine, boil them in water to make a strong tea, strain out the needles, add white sugar to the tea, boil until it reached the hardball stage, drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate, let them cool and harden. The smell was pine resin and sugar. The taste was medicinal, sharp pine flavor, slightly bitter. Not like candy, but like cough drops made at home. It cost nothing in 1945 if you gathered pine needles from the forest, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because pine trees grew everywhere in the mountains. Pine needle tea was believed to cure coughs and colds, and boiling it with sugar preserved the medicine in candy form. No drugstore cough drops. No doctor visits, just pine needles and sugar. Some families added honey instead of sugar for extra throat-soothing properties, while others kept it plain because the pine flavor was strong enough. The drops were sticky and resinous, coating your mouth with pine oil. Children hated them because they tasted like medicine, but mothers made them anyway because winter colds required treatment and store-bought cough drops cost money. By the 1960s, when commercial cough drops became affordable and people stopped making home remedies, pine needle sugar drops disappeared from mountain kitchens. But during the 1940s and 50s, they were a practical way to treat respiratory illness, turning free pine needles into medicinal candy that soothed sore throats and suppressed coughs. The drops stayed sticky even in cold weather and had to be wrapped individually in waxed paper. But if pine needle drops felt too medicinal, what came next was earthier and made from bitter roots. Bitter root honey candy wasn't sweet. It was candy when wild roots like sassafras, dandelion, and burdock were believed to purify blood and you needed medicine. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 2 hours. Dig wild roots from the forest or field, scrub them clean, and chop them into small pieces, boil them in water to make a strong decoction, strain out the root pieces, add wild honey to the liquid, boil until it thickened and reached the soft ball stage. Pour into a greased pan, let it cool and firm up, cut into squares. The smell was earthy roots and wild honey. The taste was bittersweet, medicinal roots mixed with floral honey. Not pleasant, but tolerable. It cost nothing in 1955 if you foraged roots and wild honey, or about 50 cents if you bought honey from a neighbor. This worked because wild roots were free. Many were believed to have medicinal properties, and honey preserved their medicine in candy form. No sugar needed. Honey alone was sweet enough. No added flavor. The roots provided all the flavor, wanted or not. Some families used ginseng root when they found it, making the candy more valuable for trade, while others used common dandelion or burdock because those grew everywhere. The candy stayed soft and sticky, almost paste-like in texture. Adults ate it in spring as a tonic to thin the blood after winter, while children avoided it because it tasted too much like dirt and bitterness. By the 1970s, when folk medicine gave way to modern pharmaceuticals, bitter root honey candy disappeared completely. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical way to take medicine, turning bitter medicinal roots into something barely palatable by mixing them with honey. The candy was never eaten for pleasure, only for health, and families made only small batches because no one wanted to eat more than necessary. But if root candy felt too bitter, what came next was woodsier and made from tree bark. Wild bark, syrup chews weren't flavored. They were candy when you stripped bark from wild cherry or sassafras trees and boiled it into medicine. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 90 minutes. Strip inner bark from wild cherry trees or sassafras roots, chop it fine, boil it in water for over an hour to extract the flavor and medicinal compounds, strain out the bark pieces, add sorghum syrup to the liquid. Boil until it thickened to the firm ball stage, pour onto a greased plate, let it cool until pliable, cut into small pieces with scissors. The smell was tree bark and sorghum. The taste was medicinal, woody, slightly sweet from the sorghum, bitter from the bark. It cost nothing in 1945 if you harvested bark yourself, plus about 15 cents for sorghum syrup. This worked because wild cherry bark was believed to cure coughs. Sassafras bark purified blood, and both trees grew throughout the mountains. No added sugar beyond the sorghum, no sweetening to hide the bitterness. Just bark and syrup. Some families made it every spring as a tonic, believing it prevented illness, while others made it only when someone had a persistent cough that wouldn't quit. The chews were dark brown and sticky, stored in jars and eaten one piece at a time. Children gagged on the bitter bark flavor, but mothers insisted they chew it slowly for the medicine to work. By the 1960s, when antibiotics and modern cough syrups became common, wild bark syrup chews disappeared from home medicine cabinets. But during the 1940s and 50s, they were a practical way to treat illness, and turning free tree bark into chewy medicine that lasted for months. The bark flavor was so strong it overpowered the sorghum, making each chew taste more like medicine than candy. But families made it anyway, because health mattered more than taste. But if bark chews felt too woody, what came next was smokier and flavored by fire. Campfire smoked candy wasn't intentional. It was candy when you boiled sugar syrup over an open fire and the smoke flavored it. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy outdoors. Build a campfire with hickory, oak, or apple wood. Hang a pot of sugar syrup over the fire. Let it boil while smoke drifted through the pot. Cook until it reached the hard crack stage. Pour onto a greased plate. Let it cool and harden. Break into pieces. The smell was wood smoke and burnt sugar. The taste was smoky sweet. Campfire flavor infused into every piece. Not for everyone, but memorable. It cost about 25 cents in 1955. White sugar from the store, firewood from the forest. This worked because outdoor fires were common for cooking during summer when heating the kitchen was unbearable. The smoke flavored the candy naturally, and no artificial flavoring was needed. No extracts, no spices, just smoke. Some families made it during camping trips or outdoor work, boiling sugar while they cooked dinner over the same fire, while others avoided it because they preferred candy without the smoky taste. The candy tasted like bacon mixed with sugar, savory and sweet at the same time. Children either loved it or hated it with no middle ground. Adults appreciated that it used the fire they were already burning, wasting no extra fuel. By the 1970s, when outdoor cooking became recreational instead of practical, campfire smoke candy disappeared because people stopped boiling candy over open fires. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical way to make candy while working outdoors, turning wood smoke into flavor without buying expensive extracts. The smoke intensity varied depending on the wood. Hickory made it taste like bacon, applewood made it fruity, oak made it earthy, and no two batches ever tasted the same. But if smoked candy felt too strong, what came next was gentler and made with foraged herbs. Herbal kettle sweet bites weren't candy. They were medicine when you boiled wild mint, sage, or thyme with sugar to cure stomach aches. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made these bites in under 40 minutes. Gather fresh wild herbs from the mountainside, mint for digestion, sage for sore throats, thyme for coughs, chop them fine, boil them in water to make a strong tea, strain out the herbs, add white sugar to the tea, boil until it reached the soft ball stage, drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate. Let them cool and harden into small bites. The smell was herbal and sweet. The taste was medicinal. Mint, cooling your throat. Sage, slightly bitter. Thyme, sharp and antiseptic. It cost nothing in 1945 if you foraged herbs, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because wild herbs grew free throughout the mountains. Each herb treated specific ailments, and sugar made the medicine easier to swallow. No drugstore medicines, no doctor prescriptions, just herbs and sugar. Some families made mint bites for children with upset stomachs, sage bites for sore throats during winter, and thyme bites for persistent coughs, labeling each batch so they knew which was which. The bites were small and hard, sucked slowly to release the herbal oils. Children tolerated them better than bitter teas because the sugar masked some of the medicinal taste. By the 1960s, when over-the-counter medicines became affordable and people stopped foraging for herbs, herbal kettle sweet bites disappeared from mountain homes, but during the 1940s and 50s, they were a practical way to treat common ailments, turning free wild herbs into medicinal candy that worked as well as anything the drugstore sold. The first 35 candies went from simple to strange, from sorghum twists to herbal kettle sweet bites that tasted like medicine. But the next 5 stay in medicinal territory: foraged mint sugar chunks, mountain sap candy strips, stove-boiled herb candy, wild cherry syrup stones, and root cellar honey drops. Foraged mint sugar chunks weren't mild. They were candy when wild mint grew thick along mountain streams, and you wanted something cooling. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Gather wild mint leaves from stream banks, chop them very fine, or boil white sugar with a little water until it reached the soft ball stage, stir in the chopped mint leaves while the sugar was still hot, pour onto a greased plate, let it cool until firm, cut into rough chunks with a buttered knife. The smell was intense mint. The taste was sharp, cooling mint that numbed your tongue, sweet sugar, green plant flavor. It cost nothing in 1955 if you foraged mint, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because wild mint grew everywhere near water. It was free for the taking, and the strong mint flavor made the candy feel special without buying peppermint extract. No artificial flavoring, no food coloring, just fresh mint and sugar. Some families pressed mint leaves into the hot sugar before it cooled, creating chunks with visible green flecks, while others strained out the mint after steeping it and leaving only the flavor. The chunks were grainy from the plant material and turned slightly green from the mint. Children loved the cooling sensation, sucking on one chunk until their entire mouth felt frozen. Adults used them for indigestion or bad breath. By the 1970s, when peppermint extract became cheap and people stopped foraging, foraged mint sugar chunks disappeared because buying extract was easier than gathering and chopping wild mint. But during the 1950s and 60s, they were a practical way to make mint candy without store-bought ingredients, turning free wild mint into something that tasted almost as good as store candy. The mint flavor was stronger and more complex than extract, slightly bitter, cooling, and green tasting, and the chunks stayed hard even in warm weather. But if mint chunks felt too strong, what came next was earthier and made from tree sap. Mountain sap candy strips weren't maple. They were candy when you tapped any tree that bled sweet sap and boiled it down. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in late winter. Tap birch, sycamore, or box elder trees by drilling a small hole and collecting the sap in buckets. Boil the sap for hours until it reduced to a thick syrup. Continue boiling until it reached the soft crack stage. Pour onto a greased plate in thin streams. Let it cool until pliable. Cut into strips with scissors. The smell was tree sap and caramelized sugar. The taste varied. Birch was minty, sycamore was mild, box elder was slightly bitter, but all was sweet once reduced. It cost nothing in 1945 if you tapped trees yourself. This worked because many trees produced sweet sap in late winter. Tapping required only a drill and patience, and boiling sap was free if you used scrap wood for fuel. No added sugar needed. The sap was naturally sweet. No flavoring. Each tree provided its own taste. Some families tapped dozens of trees and boiled sap for days, while others made only a small batch because boiling required constant attention. The strips were chewy and sticky, stored rolled in waxed paper. Children ate them like taffy, pulling and stretching them. Adults appreciated that they required no store-bought ingredients, just trees, buckets, and fire. By the 1960s, when maple syrup became commercially available and people stopped tapping non-maple trees, mountain sap candy strips disappeared completely. But during the 1940s and 50s, they were a practical way to make candy from trees that weren't sugar maples, proving that sweet sap came from many species if you knew where to look. The sap from different trees produced different flavors, and families developed preferences. Some swore birch was best, others preferred sycamore, but all agreed that homemade tree sap candy beat store candy because it cost nothing and tasted like the forest. But if sap candy felt too time-consuming, what came next was faster and made on the stove. Stove-boiled herb candy wasn't flavored with extracts. It was candy when you boiled sugar with whatever herbs grew in the garden. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy in under 30 minutes. Gather fresh herbs from the garden, lemon balm, bee balm, or anise hyssop, chop them fine. Boil white sugar with water until it dissolved. Add the chopped herbs. Continue boiling until it reached the hard ball stage. Strain out the herbs if desired. Pour onto a greased plate. Let it cool and harden. Break into pieces. The smell was herbal and sweet. The taste was complex. Each herb provided different flavor notes. Lemon balm tasted citrusy. Bee balm tasted minty. Anise hyssop tasted like licorice. It cost nothing in 1955 if you grew herbs, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because herb gardens grew near every mountain home. Herbs were easy to grow and required no care, and boiling them with sugar captured their flavor without buying expensive extracts. No peppermint oil, no lemon extract, no artificial flavoring, just fresh herbs. Some families experimented with different herbs and creating unique flavors no store sold, while others stuck to familiar mint or lemon balm because those were most popular with children. The candy retained the green color and plant material from the herbs, giving it a rough, homemade appearance. Children liked the citrusy lemon balm candy best, while adults preferred the stronger anise hyssop. By the 1970s, when flavored extracts became cheap and herb gardens became less common, stove-boiled herb candy disappeared, because buying a bottle of extract was easier than growing, harvesting, and chopping fresh herbs. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical way to make flavored candy without store-bought ingredients, turning garden herbs into something sweet that lasted for weeks. The herb flavors were more subtle and complex than extracts, creating candy that tasted fresh and green instead of artificial. But if herb candy felt too subtle, what came next was sharper and made from wild cherry trees. Wild cherry syrup stones weren't soft. They were candy when wild cherry bark made medicinal syrup and you boiled it until it hardened. Hillbilly families in the 1940s made this candy in under 2 hours. Strip inner bark from wild cherry trees, chop it into small pieces, boil it in water for over an hour to extract the medicinal compounds, strain out the bark, Add white sugar to the dark liquid, boil until it reached the hard crack stage, drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate, let them harden into irregular stones. The smell was bitter cherry bark and sugar. The taste was medicinal, cherry cough, syrup flavor, intensely concentrated, hard as rocks. It cost nothing in 1945 if you harvested bark yourself, plus about 30 cents for sugar. This worked because wild cherry bark was a traditional cough remedy. The bark was free throughout the mountains, and boiling it with sugar preserved the medicine in hard candy form. No store-bought cough drops, no cherry flavoring, just real cherry bark. Some families made large batches every fall to prepare for winter colds, while others made it only when someone developed a persistent cough. The stones were so hard they took 5 minutes to dissolve in your mouth, releasing bitter cherry flavor slowly. Children hated them because they tasted too much like medicine, but mothers insisted they suck on one whenever they coughed. By the 1960s, when commercial cherry-flavored cough drops became common, wild cherry syrup stones disappeared from medicine cabinets. But during the 1940s and 50s, they were a practical way to treat coughs, turning free wild cherry bark into medicinal candy that worked as well as anything the drugstore sold. The cherry bark contained compounds that suppressed coughs naturally, and the hard candy form meant the medicine dissolved slowly, coating the throat for extended relief. But if cherry stones felt too medicinal, what came next was softer and made from roots stored underground. Root cellar honey drops weren't fresh. They were candy when honey sat in the root cellar for months and started to crystallize. Hillbilly families in the 1950s made this candy when crystallized honey became too thick to pour. Scoop crystallized honey into a pot, heat it gently until it liquefied again. She continue heating until it thickened and darkened. Test by dropping a spoonful into cold water. If it hardened, it was ready. Drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate. Let them cool and harden into drops. The smell was concentrated honey and caramelized sugar. The taste was intense, darker and richer than fresh honey, almost burnt, complex layers of flavor. It cost nothing in 1955 if you used honey already in the cellar. This worked because honey never spoiled. Crystallization was natural and harmless, and heating it transformed texture without adding ingredients. No added sugar, no flavoring, just old honey heated until it became candy. Some families deliberately let honey crystallize so they could make this candy, while others made it only when they discovered forgotten jars in the root cellar. The drops were dark amber and sticky, and stored in jars with waxed paper between layers. Children liked them better than fresh honey because they were easier to handle and less messy. Adults appreciated that it used up crystallized honey that was difficult to spread on biscuits. By the 1970s, when people started throwing away crystallized honey instead of reheating it, root cellar honey drops disappeared because modern cooks didn't know that crystallization was reversible and usable. But during the 1950s and 60s, it was a practical way to salvage honey that had sat too long, turning thick crystallized honey into hard candy that lasted indefinitely. The heating process caramelized natural sugars in the honey, creating deeper flavor than fresh honey provided, and the drops never melted even in summer heat because the honey was cooked past its moisture content. But if honey drops felt too thick, what came next was lighter and made from ingredients nobody expected. The first 40 candies used everything mountains provided: tree sap, wild herbs, cherry bark, crystallized honey, and smoke from fires. But the final 20 go into survival territory: cornmeal syrup nuggets, fried flour bites, skillet lard candy, milk skin squares, and pantry scrap blocks that turned waste into sweetness. When the sugar jar ran low and the candy jar stayed empty, hillbilly families boiled cornmeal with sorghum syrup until it turned thick and sweet. Pour 2 cups of yellow cornmeal into a cast-iron skillet. Add 1 cup of sorghum syrup. Stir over medium heat until the mixture pulled away from the sides, then drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate to cool. The smell was earthy, sweet sorghum mixed with toasted corn, and the taste was grainy, sticky, and faintly bitter, like cornbread mixed with molasses. Each nugget cost about 15 cents to make, and the batch lasted a week if you hid it from the younger kid. The texture was rough, gritty from the cornmeal, sticky from the syrup, and dense enough to chew for minutes. Some families added a pinch of salt or a spoonful of lard to make it smoother, but most kept it plain because extras cost money. The candy didn't melt in the heat, didn't spoil in the pantry, and didn't need refrigeration, which made it practical when ice was scarce and summers were long. The candy kept for days in a covered tin. And some families made it every week when the syrup jar was full. Others made it once and never again because the kids refused to eat it twice. The nuggets were often served after dinner when there was nothing else sweet on the table. Some mothers pressed them into flat discs instead of nuggets, and some rolled them in extra cornmeal to keep them from sticking together. The candy was filling enough to stop hunger, which made it more practical than sweet. By the time store-bought candy became affordable, cornmeal syrup nuggets disappeared from kitchen tables, and most families forgot they ever made them. If cornmeal syrup nuggets felt too gritty, what came next was even stranger: candy made from fried flour and sugar that tasted like survival, not sweetness. When the pantry held nothing but flour, sugar, and lard, Hillbilly families fried spoonfuls of dough in hot fat and rolled them in sugar while they were still warm. Mix 2 cups of flour with 1 tablespoon of sugar and enough water to form a thick dough. Drop spoonfuls into a skillet of melted lard, fry until golden brown, drain on a rag, then roll in granulated sugar. The smell was rich, fried dough and hot fat, and the taste was plain, greasy, and faintly sweet, like a donut without the yeast. Each batch cost about 20 cents, and the bites were eaten warm because they turned hard and greasy when they cooled. The texture was dense, chewy on the inside, slightly crisp on the outside, and coated with a thin layer of sugar that stuck to your fingers. Some families drizzled sorghum syrup over the top or added cinnamon to the sugar, but most kept it plain because extras weren't in the budget. The bites didn't last long. They were best eaten the same day, and by the next morning they were stale and hard. Some mothers shaped the dough into small balls before frying, while others dropped irregular spoonfuls straight into the hot fat. The bites were often made on Saturday afternoons when the lard was still warm from frying meat, and the sugar bowl had just enough left for rolling. Children ate them standing in the kitchen, licking the sugar off their fingers and reaching for seconds before the plate was empty. By the time packaged snack cakes and cookies became common, fried flour bites faded from family kitchens, and most grandchildren never tasted them. If fried flour bites felt too plain, what came next was even more unsettling: candy made from pork fat and sugar that tasted more like survival than sweetness. When the sugar supply was tight and candy was a luxury, some hillbilly families boiled lard with sugar until it hardened into brittle, glossy chunks. Melt 1 cup of lard in a cast-iron skillet. Add 2 cups of sugar. Stir constantly over medium heat until the mixture turned amber. Pour onto a greased plate and break into pieces once it cooled. The smell was heavy, rendered fat mixed with burnt sugar, and the taste was fatty, sweet, and slightly salty, like eating crystallized bacon grease. Each batch cost about 30 cents, and the candy kept for weeks in a tin because the fat preserved it. The texture was brittle, hard like peanut brittle but greasier, and it left a film on your tongue that lingered long after you finished chewing. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of vanilla extract, but most made it plain because flavorings cost extra. The candy didn't melt in the heat, didn't attract ants and didn't spoil quickly, which made it practical for families who couldn't afford store-bought sweets. Some mothers wrapped individual pieces in scraps of wax paper, while others stored the chunks loose in a tin can with a tight lid. The candy was often made after hog butchering when there was extra lard to spare, and the sugar sack still had a few cups left. Children ate it slowly because the grease coated their throats and made them thirsty. By the time commercial candies became more affordable, lard candy disappeared from Appalachian kitchens, and most families stopped making it entirely. If lard candy felt too greasy, what came next was stranger still: candy made from the skin that forms on boiled milk, sweetened and dried into chewy strips. When fresh milk was plentiful but sugar was scarce, hillbilly families boiled milk until a thick skin formed on top, peeled it off, sweetened it with a spoonful of sugar, and dried it into chewy squares. Pour raw milk into a pot, bring it to a gentle boil, let the skin form on the surface, carefully lift it off with a spoon, lay it flat on a plate, sprinkle sugar over the top, and let it dry overnight. The smell was faint, warm milk and sweetness, and the taste was mild, creamy, and slightly tangy, like eating a sheet of dried cream. Each batch cost almost nothing because it used the milk skin that would have been thrown away. The texture was thin and chewy, almost like dried fruit leather, but less sticky and more delicate. Some families added a drop of vanilla or a pinch of cinnamon, but most kept it plain because the milk itself was precious. The candy didn't last long. It had to be eaten within a few days before it spoiled, which made it a rare treat rather than a staple. Some mothers layered multiple skins on top of each other to create thicker squares, while others kept them single layer and translucent. The candy was often made during the summer months when the cows produced the most milk, and there was extra to spare after making butter and cheese. Children ate it carefully because tearing the thin sheet felt wasteful. By the time homogenized milk replaced raw milk in most homes, milk skin candy disappeared, and most people forgot it ever existed. If milk skin candy felt too delicate, what came next was darker candy made from boiled grain, sweetened with honey, and pressed into dense blocks that tasted like survival rations. When the sugar ran out and the candy jar stayed empty, hillbilly families boiled together whatever scraps they had. Leftover oatmeal, cornmeal, a spoonful of sorghum, a handful of nuts, and pressed the mixture into blocks that hardened into dense, chewy squares. Gather whatever was left in the pantry, mix it with enough sorghum syrup or honey to bind it together, heat it on the stove until it thickened, press it into a greased pan, and cut it into squares once it cooled. The smell was earthy. Toasted grain, burnt sugar, and whatever else went into the pot, and the taste was unpredictable, dense, and filling, more like compressed survival rations than candy. Each batch cost almost nothing because it used scraps that would have been thrown away. The texture was dense and heavy, hard to chew, coarse from the grain, and sticky from the syrup. Some families added dried fruit or a pinch of salt, but most made it with whatever they had because the point was to use everything and waste nothing. The candy didn't melt, didn't spoil quickly, and didn't require refrigeration, which made it practical for families who lived far from stores. Some mothers pressed the mixture into shallow pans and cut it into rectangles, while others rolled it into balls and flattened them with their palms. The candy was often made at the end of the month, when the pantry was nearly empty and there was nothing else to serve for dessert. Children chewed it slowly because swallowing too fast made their stomachs hurt. By the time packaged granola bars and snack cakes became common, homemade scrap candy faded from kitchen tables, and most families stopped making it entirely. The first 45 candies were rough: cornmeal syrup nuggets, fried flour bites, lard sweet chunks, milk skin squares, and pantry scrap blocks. But the final 15 go deeper: candy made from boiled grain, stove fat, rendered syrup, tin can cooking, and plain survival sugar. The kind of sweets you made when there was nothing left but heat and hope. When honey was more available than sugar and the grain bin still had a few handfuls of oats or wheat, hillbilly families boiled the grain with honey until it turned sticky and sweet. Pour 2 cups of oats or cracked wheat into a pot, add 1 cup of honey, stir over low heat until the grains softened and the honey thickened. Then spread the mixture onto a greased plate and cut it into squares once it cooled. The smell was warm, toasted grain and floral honey, and the taste was chewy, mildly sweet and earthy, like eating sweetened porridge that had been pressed flat. Each batch cost about 40 cents, and the candy kept for days in a covered tin. The texture was dense, chewy and coarse, with whole grains that stuck in your teeth. Some families added a pinch of cinnamon or a handful of chopped nuts, but most made it plain because extras weren't in the budget. The candy didn't melt in the heat, didn't spoil quickly, and didn't require refrigeration, which made it practical for families who lived in cabins without ice. Some mothers pressed the mixture thin and cut it into small squares, while others formed it into thick bars and wrapped them in cloth. Because the candy was often made during the fall months when honey was harvested and the grain bins were full from the harvest. Children ate it slowly because the grains took time to chew and the honey made them thirsty. By the time store-bought granola bars and energy bars became common, homemade grain candy disappeared from family kitchens and most recipes were lost. If boiled grain candy felt too rough, what came next was even stranger. Candy made from rendered pork fat mixed with syrup, cooled into greasy chunks. When the hog was butchered and every part had to be used, hillbilly families rendered the fatback, mixed the hot grease with sugar, and cooled it into brittle, greasy crumbles. Render 1 cup of fatback in a skillet until the fat melted and the cracklings were crispy. Remove the cracklings. Add 2 cups of sugar to the hot fat, stir until the sugar dissolved, pour the mixture onto a greased plate, and break it into pieces once it hardened. The smell was heavy, rendered pork fat and burnt sugar, and the taste was fatty, sweet and salty, like eating crystallized bacon grease. Each batch cost about 25 cents, and the candy kept for weeks because the fat preserved it. The texture was brittle and greasy. It shattered like peanut brittle but left a slick coating on your tongue. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of vanilla, but most kept it plain because the fat itself was valuable. The candy didn't melt easily, didn't attract bugs, and didn't spoil quickly, which made it practical for families who couldn't afford store-bought sweets. Some mothers poured the mixture into shallow pans and scored it into squares before it hardened, while others let it cool in irregular shapes and broke it by hand. The candy was often made in the winter months, after hog butchering when there was extra fat to render and the weather was cold enough to keep it from melting. Children ate it in secret because eating fatback candy in public felt shameful. By the time commercial candies became more affordable, fatback candy disappeared from mountain kitchens, and most families never made it again. If fatback crumbles felt too greasy, what came next was darker, candy made from the drippings left in the stove pan, scraped up and sweetened. When the stove pan was scraped clean and nothing was wasted, some hillbilly families collected the fat drippings from cooking, mixed them with sugar, and cooled them into hard, greasy drops. Scrape the fat from the bottom of the stove pan after frying meat or boiling beans. Collect about half a cup of drippings, heat it in a small pot. Stir in 1 cup of sugar until it dissolved. Drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate, and let them harden. The smell was gamey, old meat fat and burnt sugar, and the taste was fatty, slightly rancid and faintly sweet, like eating hardened cooking grease. Each batch cost almost nothing because it used fat that would have been thrown away. The texture was hard and waxy. It melted slowly in your mouth and left a greasy film on your lips. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of vanilla extract, but most made it plain because the point was to use what was left, not to make something fancy. The candy didn't spoil quickly because the fat preserved it, but it tasted better when fresh. Some mothers stored the drops in small tins, while others kept them in a jar with a tight lid to prevent the smell from spreading. The candy was often made at the end of the week, when the stove pan was full of accumulated drippings and there was nothing else sweet to serve. Children ate it alone because eating stove-fat candy in front of visitors felt embarrassing. By the time packaged candies became more affordable, stove-fat candy disappeared from Appalachian homes, and most recipes were lost. If stove-fat drops felt too harsh, what came next was even more extreme: candy made from rendered syrup mixed with whatever scraps of fat were left. When the syrup jar was nearly empty and the fat scraps were collected from cooking, hillbilly families boiled them together until they hardened into dense, greasy chunks. Pour half a cup of sorghum syrup into a pot, add a few spoonfuls of rendered fat from frying or cooking, stir over low heat until the mixture thickened, pour it onto a greased plate, and break it into pieces once it cooled. The smell was sharp, burnt syrup and old fat, and the taste was fatty, intensely sweet, and slightly bitter, like eating hardened molasses mixed with lard. Each batch cost about 20 cents, and the candy kept for weeks in a tin because the fat preserved it. The texture was hard and greasy. It shattered like brittle but left a slick coating on your tongue. The first 49 candies were survival: cornmeal nuggets, fried flour bites, lard chunks, milk skin squares, scrap blocks, grain honey candy, fatback crumbles, stove fat drops, and rendered syrup chunks. But the final 11 go into the deepest territory: candy made over campfires in tin cans with burnt sugar and ash. When families lived in remote cabins without cookware or traveled for work, some hillbilly families boiled sugar directly in a tin can over an open fire to make candy. Find an empty tin can, add 2 cups of sugar and a 1/4 cup of water, place the can over hot coals, stir with a stick until the sugar dissolved and turned amber, then pour the molten sugar onto a flat rock or greased plate to cool. The smell was sharp, burnt sugar and smoke, and the taste was intensely sweet with a faint metallic tang from the can. Each batch cost about 15 cents, and the candy hardened into brittle glass-like shards. The texture was brittle and sharp. It shattered into pieces that could cut your mouth if you weren't careful. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of lard to smooth it out, but most made it plain because the point was to create something sweet with minimal resources. The candy didn't last long. It melted in the heat and attracted ants. But for families on the move or living in rough conditions, it was a rare treat. Some mothers poured the sugar onto flat rocks to cool, while others used the bottom of a greased plate if they had one. The candy was often made during the summer months when families traveled for seasonal work and had no access to a proper kitchen. Children ate it carefully because the sharp edges could slice their tongues. By the time packaged candies became widely available, tin can candy disappeared from Appalachian traditions, and most families never made it again. If tin can candy felt too dangerous, what came next was darker: candy made from burnt sugar, scraped from the bottom of the pan. When the sugar pot boiled over or the syrup burned to the bottom of the pan, hillbilly families scraped the blackened crust, broke it into pieces, and ate it as candy. Boil sugar or syrup until it scorched to the pan, let the pan cool, scrape the burnt layer off with a knife, and break the hardened pieces into bite-sized chunks. And the smell was acrid: burnt sugar and char, and the taste was bitter, intensely sweet, and slightly smoky, like eating caramelized sugar that had been cooked too long. Each batch cost nothing because it was made from a cooking mistake. The texture was hard and brittle. It shattered into sharp fragments that stuck to your teeth and dissolved slowly. Some families soaked the burnt pieces in water to soften them, but most ate them straight because softening took time. The candy had no shelf life. It was eaten immediately after being scraped from the pan, and it tasted better when fresh. Some children fought over who got to scrape the pan, while others refused to eat the burnt pieces entirely. The candy was often made by accident when the syrup was left on the stove too long or the fire burned too hot. Children ate it in secret because admitting you ate burnt pan scrapings felt shameful. By the time Teflon pans and better cookware became common, burnt pan candy disappeared from mountain kitchens, and most families stopped scraping the pans clean. If burnt pan candy felt too harsh, what came next was stranger: candy made from the sweet drippings that fell from the wood stove. When families cooked over wood stoves and syrup pots bubbled on the heat, some hillbilly children collected the hardened drips that fell from the pot onto the stovetop and ate them as candy. Wait for the syrup to boil over, let the drips harden on the hot stove surface, scrape them off with a knife once they cooled, and eat the brittle, sticky pieces. The smell was faint, burnt sorghum and wood smoke, and the taste was intensely sweet with a smoky, slightly bitter edge. Each piece cost nothing because it was collected from spills. The texture was hard and glossy, like shards of amber glass, and it stuck to your teeth as it melted. Children fought over who got to scrape the stove because the drips were the only candy they'd taste all week. By the time electric stoves replaced wood stoves in most homes, wood stove drip candy disappeared from Appalachian traditions, and most children never tasted it. If wood stove drips felt too accidental, what came next was even more extreme: candy made from sugar crystals formed in the ash pan beneath the stove. When families burned wood for heat and cooking, some hillbilly children discovered that if you dropped a spoonful of sugar into the ash pan beneath the stove, the heat would caramelize it into hard, blackened crystals. Scoop a spoonful of sugar, drop it into the ash pan where the coals were still warm, wait for it to melt and harden, then scrape it out once it cooled. The smell was smoky, burnt sugar and ash, and the taste was intensely sweet, with a gritty, charred edge. But each piece cost almost nothing because it was made from sugar that would have been wasted. The texture was brittle and gritty, coated in fine ash that clung to the sugar. Some children rinsed the crystals under water, but most ate them as they were because the sweetness outweighed the ash. The candy had no shelf life. It was eaten immediately after being scraped from the pan, and it tasted better when the sugar had caramelized without burning completely. Some children made it deliberately, while others discovered it by accident when sugar spilled into the ash pan. The candy was often made during the winter months when the wood stove burned constantly, and there was always heat in the ash pan. Children ate it alone because eating ash-cooked candy in front of adults meant getting scolded. By the time electric stoves replaced wood stoves in most homes, ash-cooked candy disappeared from mountain traditions, and most families never heard of it again. If ash-cooked crystals felt too dirty, what came next was simpler but bleaker: candy made from plain boiled sugar with no flavor, no color, and no extras. When the pantry was empty and there was nothing left but sugar and water, hillbilly families boiled sugar until it hardened into plain, flavorless candy. Pour 2 cups of sugar into a pot, add half a cup of water, stir over medium heat until the sugar dissolved and turned clear, pour it onto a greased plate, and break it into pieces once it hardened. The smell was faint, just hot sugar, and the taste was pure sweetness with no flavor, no color, and no extras. Each batch cost about 20 cents, and the candy kept for weeks in a covered tin. The texture was hard and brittle, like glass, and it dissolved slowly in your mouth. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of vanilla extract if they had it, but most made it plain because the point was to create something sweet with the bare minimum. The candy didn't melt easily, didn't spoil, and didn't require refrigeration, which made it practical for families who lived in remote cabins. Some mothers poured the sugar into small molds, while others let it cool flat and broke it into irregular pieces. The candy was often made at the end of the month when there was nothing left to sweeten with, and the children begged for something sweet. Children sucked on it slowly because biting down could crack their teeth. By the time store-bought candies became more affordable, plain sugar candy disappeared from Appalachian homes, and most families never made it again. If plain sugar candy felt too empty, what came next was slightly more elaborate. Candy wrapped in corn husks to preserve it. The first 54 candies were survival: tin can boiled candy, burnt pan sugar, wood stove drips, ash-cooked crystals, and plain boiled sugar. But the final 6 go into the softest territory: candy wrapped in corn husks, made from tree bark, wild seeds, foraged roots, campfire sugar, and last resort plain candy. When families needed to preserve candy without wax paper or tins, some hillbilly families wrapped boiled sugar chunks in dried corn husks to keep them clean and dry. Boil 2 cups of sugar with half a cup of water until it hardened. Pour the syrup onto a greased plate, cut it into squares once it cooled, wrap each piece in a strip of dried corn husk, and store them in a basket. The smell was faint, sweet sugar and dried corn, and the taste was pure sweetness with a slight vegetal edge from the husk. Each batch cost about 25 cents, and the wrapped candies kept for weeks. The texture was hard and brittle. The sugar shattered into pieces when you bit it. Some families added a drop of vanilla or a pinch of cinnamon before wrapping, but most kept it plain because the husks themselves were the luxury. The candy didn't melt in the heat, didn't spoil, and didn't attract bugs, which made it ideal for families who lived in cabins without refrigeration. Some mothers tied the ends of the husks with string, while others folded them closed and tucked the ends under. The candy was often made in the fall after the corn harvest when there were plenty of dried husks to use. Children unwrapped the candy slowly because the husks themselves smelled sweet. By the time plastic wrap and wax paper became affordable, corn husk candy wraps disappeared from Appalachian traditions, and most families forgot how to make them. If corn husk wraps felt too rustic, what came next was stranger: candy made from boiled tree bark, sweetened with honey. When sugar was scarce and the forest was close, some hillbilly families boiled strips of sweet inner bark, usually birch or sassafras, with honey until it turned sticky and chewy. Peel strips of inner bark from a tree, boil them in water until soft, drain the water, add honey. Peel strips of inner bark from a tree, boil them in water until soft, drain the water, add honey, and simmer until the bark absorbed the sweetness. The smell was earthy, woodsy bark and floral honey, and the taste was mildly sweet with a bitter vegetal edge. Each batch cost almost nothing because the bark was foraged and the honey was often wild. The texture was chewy and fibrous, like eating sweetened wood pulp. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of vanilla, but most ate it plain because the honey itself was precious. The candy didn't last long. It had to be eaten within a few days before it dried out or spoiled. Some mothers cut the bark into thin strips before boiling, while others left it in longer pieces and tore it by hand after it cooled. The bark had to be harvested carefully. Too much taken from one tree could kill it. So families rotated between trees and only peeled thin layers from the inner bark, where the sap still ran sweet. The candy was often made in the spring when the sap was running and the inner bark was easiest to peel. Children chewed it slowly because the bark fibers took time to break down, and swallowing too quickly could make you choke. Some families stored the strips in jars with extra honey to keep them moist, while others hung them to dry and chewed them like leather. The taste varied depending on the tree. Birch bark was sweeter and milder, while sassafras had a sharper, more medicinal flavor that some children refused to eat. By the time commercial candies became widely available, tree bark candy disappeared from mountain kitchens, and most families never made it again. And the knowledge of which trees to harvest and how to peel the bark without damaging the tree was passed down through generations, but as families moved to towns and children grew up with access to stores, the tradition faded. Most grandchildren never tasted tree bark candy, and the few who heard about it thought it sounded too wild to be real. If tree bark candy felt too wild, what came next was darker: candy made from wild seeds boiled in syrup. When the pantry was empty and the fields were full of wild grasses, some hillbilly families collected wild seeds, like amaranth or lamb's quarters, and boiled them with sorghum syrup to make candy. Gather a handful of wild seeds, rinse them clean, boil them in water until soft, drain, add sorghum syrup, and simmer until the mixture thickened, and then drop spoonfuls onto a greased plate to cool. The smell was earthy: toasted seeds and burnt syrup, and the taste was mildly sweet with a grassy, slightly bitter edge. Each batch cost almost nothing because the seeds were foraged. The texture was dense and chewy, coarse from the seeds and sticky from the syrup. Some families added a pinch of salt or a drop of honey, but most kept it plain because the point was to use what was free. The candy didn't spoil quickly, but it tasted better when fresh. Some mothers formed the mixture into small balls, while others dropped it in irregular spoonfuls onto the plate. The seeds had to be gathered at the right time. Too early, and they were too soft. Too late, and they were too hard. Families who knew the land knew exactly when to harvest each type of wild seed. The candy was often made in the late summer when the wild grasses were seeding and there was nothing else to harvest. Children ate it without complaint, because complaining meant going hungry. Some families made it as a winter treat, drying the seeds in the fall and storing them in cloth bags until the syrup was ready. The taste was never consistent. Some batches were sweeter, some more bitter, depending on which seeds were available and how long they were boiled. Children learned to recognize the different seeds by taste, and some preferred certain grasses over others. By the time store-bought candies became more affordable, wild seed candy disappeared from Appalachian homes, and most recipes were lost. When the sugar jar was empty and the syrup was nearly gone, some hillbilly families dug up wild roots, like burdock or chicory, boiled them until soft, mashed them into a paste, and sweetened them with a spoonful of sorghum or honey to make them barely edible. Each batch cost almost nothing because the roots were foraged from the wild for free. The texture was dense and pasty, almost like eating sweetened dirt or clay. Some families added a pinch of cinnamon or a drop of vanilla to mask the bitterness, but most kept it plain because the ingredients themselves were scarce and precious. The candy didn't last long. It had to be eaten within a few days before it spoiled and turned moldy. Some mothers pressed the paste thin and cut it into small squares with a wet knife, while others rolled it into small balls between their palms and dusted them with extra flour or cornmeal to keep them from sticking to each other. The roots had to be dug at exactly the right time of year. Spring roots were more tender, less bitter, and easier to chew, while fall roots were tougher, more woody, and almost impossible to soften no matter how long you boiled them. The candy was often made in the early spring when the roots were tender and easy to dig, and the winter stores were completely gone and there was nothing left to eat. Children ate it reluctantly because refusing meant going without dessert or any sweetness entirely, and even bitter candy was better than no candy at all. Some families dried the paste completely in the sun or near the stove and stored it for weeks, rehydrating it with a little water when they wanted something sweet or needed to quiet hungry children. The taste was never pleasant or enjoyable. It was always too earthy, too bitter, too strange, and too close to eating dirt, but it was sweet enough to count as candy when there was absolutely nothing else. By the time commercial candies became widely available in stores, foraged root paste disappeared from mountain kitchens, and most families never made it again or spoke of it. The knowledge of which roots were safe to eat and which were poisonous was passed down carefully from mother to daughter, and mistakes could be deadly and swift. Most grandchildren never learned to identify wild roots or how to prepare them. The few who heard about root paste candy refused to believe their grandmothers ever ate something so desperate and strange. If foraged root paste felt too extreme and desperate, what came next was simpler but bleaker: candy made over a campfire with just sugar and a tin can. When families traveled for work or lived temporarily in camps, some hillbilly families boiled sugar over an open fire until it hardened into thick, brittle slabs that could be carried in a pocket and eaten throughout the day. Pour 2 cups of sugar into an empty tin can, add a 1/4 cup of water, place the can directly over hot coals glowing red, stir constantly with a stick to keep it from burning, pour the molten sugar onto a flat rock or greased plate and break it into thick pieces once it cooled and hardened completely. The smell was sharp, sugar and wood smoke, and the taste was intensely sweet with a strong, smoky edge that reminded you this was made over fire, not in a proper kitchen. Each batch cost about 20 cents, and the candy hardened into slabs that could be carried in a pocket without melting or breaking. The texture was hard and brittle, like glass or ice, and it shattered into sharp fragments when you bit down. Some families added a pinch of salt or a small drop of lard to smooth it out and make it less brittle, but most made it plain because the point was to create something sweet with minimal resources and no proper equipment. The candy didn't melt easily, even in summer heat, and didn't spoil or attract ants, which made it practical for families constantly on the move. Some mothers wrapped the slabs in scraps of cloth or old newspaper, or while others carried them loose in their pockets or tucked into their aprons. The sugar had to be watched carefully and stirred constantly. If it boiled too long, it burned and turned black and bitter. If it didn't boil long enough, it stayed sticky and never hardened properly. Candy was often made during the summer months when families traveled for seasonal work, picking crops or logging, and camped in tents or rough shelters with no access to proper kitchens. Children carried pieces in their pockets and sucked on them slowly throughout the day to make them last as long as possible. Some families made it every night around the campfire after supper, using whatever sugar they had managed to buy or trade for in the last town they passed through. Or the candy became a small ritual and a moment of comfort, small sweetness at the end of a long, hard day of travel or back-breaking work in the fields. Some children learned to make it themselves under their mother's watchful eye, stirring the sugar carefully in the tin can while their parents set up camp or tended the fire. By the time packaged candies became widely available in stores, Campfire sugar hardtack disappeared from Appalachian traditions, and most families never made it again or taught their children how. When the pantry was completely empty and there was nothing left but sugar and water, hillbilly families boiled sugar until it hardened into plain, flavorless candy with no butter, no honey, no milk, no vanilla, and no hope of anything better. Pour 2 cups of sugar into a pot. Add 1/2 cup of water. Stir constantly over medium heat until the sugar dissolved completely and turned clear like glass. Pour it carefully onto a greased plate and break it into sharp pieces once it hardened and turned brittle. The smell was faint, just hot sugar with no other aroma or scent, and the taste was pure sweetness with no flavor, no complexity, no color, and absolutely no extras to make it interesting or memorable. Each batch cost about 20 cents, and the candy kept for weeks in a covered tin without spoiling. The texture was hard and brittle, like eating shards of broken glass or ice, and it dissolved painfully slowly in your mouth, taking minutes to melt completely. Some families added a pinch of salt if they had any left, but most made it plain because there was nothing left to add and nothing left to give. The candy didn't melt easily, even in summer heat. didn't spoil or turn rancid, and didn't require refrigeration or any special storage, which made it practical for families who had nothing else. Some mothers poured the hot sugar carefully into small molds made from empty tin cans or jar lids, while others let it cool flat and formless on a plate, and broke it into random, irregular pieces with their bare hands. The sugar had to be watched constantly and stirred without stopping. If it boiled too long, it turned amber and tasted burnt and bitter. If it didn't boil long enough, it stayed soft and sticky and never hardened properly. Candy was often made at the very end of the month when there was absolutely nothing left in the pantry to cook or serve, and the children cried and begged desperately for something sweet to end the day. Children ate it in complete silence because there was nothing left to celebrate, nothing left to hope for, and nothing left to look forward to. Some families made it every week when the sugar sack was still full at the beginning of the month, storing the pieces carefully in a tin can for emergencies or desperate times when there was truly nothing else. Others made it only once or twice a year, when things were truly, hopelessly desperate and there was no other option left. The candy had no personality, no character, no story, and no soul. It was just sweetness, pure and empty, and completely devoid of anything that made it memorable, meaningful, or worth eating except the desperate, hopeless circumstances under which it was made. By the time store-bought candies became more affordable and widely available, plain sugar candy disappeared from mountain homes, and most families never made it again or spoke of it. Memory of boiling sugar with nothing else, no butter, no milk, and no flavoring, no extras, became a symbol of how far families had come and how much they had survived. Most grandchildren refused to believe their grandmothers ever ate candy so plain and empty, but the older generation remembered it clearly and vividly, and some still made it when they wanted to remember what it felt like to have nothing at all. Hillbilly candies, old taffy, boiled fudge, cracked brittle, beaten divinity, pine needle drops, bitter root honey, cornmeal nuggets, fried flour bites, lard chunks, milkskin squares, scrap blocks, boiled grain honey, fatback crumbles, stove fat drops, rendered syrup chunks, tin can candy, burnt pan sugar, wood stove drips, ash crystals, plain boiled sugar, corn husk wraps, tree bark honey, wild seed drops, foraged root paste, campfire hardtac, and last resort plain candy. These weren't fancy. They were survival made sweet when there was nothing else. Drop a comment below and tell us, did your grandmother make any of these hillbilly candies? Which one sounds the wildest to you? Have you ever tasted burnt pan sugar or corn husk wraps? Share your family's candy stories. We want to hear what your grandma made when there was nothing left.